Okay, this is the third video covering Chapter 31 on the deficits and debt. In this chapter, we are going to look at objective number 3. We're going to talk about the difference between deficits and debt. I've already kind of covered that. I told you that deficits are a flow concept and debt is a stock concept, but we'll review that again. And the big thing here is to understand why debt needs to be judged relative to assets. And talk about kind of the debate amongst economists as to whether or not, the current level of the U.S. debt relative to GDP is something we should be concerned about or not. And there's no simple answer, and economists are kind of divided on the issue of the importance of the debt to GDP ratio. So I can't give you definitive answers, but I can, kind of outline the concerns for you. We will discuss the current stimulus package as a fiscal policy at the end of the next chapter. So we're really closing in on it now. After this video, I'm going to try to get the next chapter in a couple of videos. And at the end, maybe in a separate video, I haven't decided yet, I'm going to cover the current economic situation that is resulting from a shutdown in a substantial portion of the U.S. economy. I mean, simply telling people they're not allowed to show up to work has a huge impact on aggregate supply, as you can imagine. And we will look at the policy response, both monetary and fiscal, and try to judge what we can expect out of those policies in terms of returning the economy to full employment. I'll give you some of my perspective and opinion on those things, though I should say that nothing like this has ever happened in the economy before. I mean, we're all in very uncertain waters. I hope that the worst case scenarios are not realized. But we will discuss all of that. But I think we need to get all of the other material out of the way, and that would be a nice way to end the course. Would be just to apply what we've learned, over the semester under very unusual circumstances for at least half of the semester, to understand the economic issues, surrounding the reason that we can no longer meet face to face. So we'll do that, and it will be a good way to wrap up the semester. So I am going to cover the stimulus package with you in light of what we learned about fiscal policy. It's coming. And we'll talk more about it soon. So we've gone through most of this material. Let's move to objective 3. Talk about the sub-objectives, right? So the sub-objectives for question 3, get my pen up here. The sub-objectives are to understand how deficits and interest on the debt are financed by the Treasury. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. We talked about a lot of these topics we've at least touched on in the previous 2 videos. We're going to outline the difference between debt for individuals and debt for the government, because they're not exactly the same. They're not completely different either, but they're not exactly the same thing. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll try to understand the distinction between the internal debt and external debt. That is, the debt that we owe to ourselves and the debt that we owe to foreigners. And that is really the biggest difference between the debt that we have accumulated today in the United States versus the debt that we've accumulated in the past, for example, to fund World War II. During World War II, at the end of World War II, we had a very high debt to GDP ratio, but we owned most of that debt internally. U.S. citizens bought war bonds to finance the war effort. And today, an awful lot of the debt that has been accumulated by the government to fund deficits, including the wars in Iraq and Iran, were not funded by U.S. citizens buying war bonds or even treasuries. It's funded by foreigners buying those bonds, and particularly China. So they've been out there financing our war on terror for a number of years, and over time we've become more indebted to them financially, and our external debt has climbed as a result. Okay, so we will look at measures of the debt to GDP ratio over time. We're just going to, get our hands grubby with the data again and get some basic trends down. and we'll compare the U.S. debt to GDP ratio to other countries to see whether or not the U.S. economy has an unusually high debt to GDP ratio or a debt to GDP ratio that looks fairly typical when looking at other industrialized, stable economies. So, getting into this, the difference between individual and government debt, what I'd say first is that the government lives forever and people unfortunately do not. So what we say is that the government is what we call a going concern. So, for all of us, a day of reckoning will come. We will die, and somebody will add up the value of our assets. They'll add up the value of our liabilities. Hopefully, our assets will cover our liabilities, and whatever's left over, we can put in some type of a will and leave it for our progeny. That day never really comes for the government, right? I mean, the government operates as though it's in existence today, and if you go 100 years out in the future, 200 years out in the future, 1,000 years in the future, the government will still be there. Okay, I don't know whether or not it actually will, but for all practical purposes, when we think about financing, that's the way that we treat the government, and we call that a going concern. So the government, another reason the government is different from so I guess what I'm saying, going back to number one here, is that we kind of have a limited lifetime over which to make the discounted present value of our spending, roughly match up with the discounted present value of what we're earning, so that when we die, we don't leave a burden for those, who follow us. The government never finds itself in that position. They have, for all practical purposes, forever, to get the discounted present value of their expenditures aligned with the discounted present value of the revenue they're collecting. So it gives them a little bit more wiggle room in terms of the the time dimension over which they need to make good on their obligations. The government can also print money, as we talked about in the last video. They can monetize the debt. We can't as people. I think I would probably be in really big trouble if I started printing up my own money and using it to pay my debt. I probably wouldn't be at Loyola teaching next year if I tried to do that. But the government is in a position where, at least to some degree, that they can do that. If they do too much of that, we know that it will lead to a hyperinflation, and so we want monetary policy to be independent from the government's decisions to run deficits and build up debt. But the government still does have the power of the printing press. They don't want to abuse that power, though, and we know why after taking this class. The government also, you should know, owes an awful lot of debt to itself, right, and to its own citizens. So when the government owes debt to itself and it pays off debt that it owes to itself, it is essentially taking money that you have in your left pocket of your jeans and putting it in the right pocket of your jeans. And so from that point of view, the increase, the bigger the amount of the debt that the government just owes to itself, or that it owes to its own citizens, the less likely the debt to GDP ratio. It's less likely that the debt to GDP ratio will be a problem. So we'll take a look at that too here in a minute. So the internal debt, then, just kind of break down number 3 here, is government debt owed to other governmental agencies or to its own citizens. That's called internal. The federal government owes a lot of money to the Social Security Trust Fund, which is another governmental agency. So when they pay off that debt, it's expensive in the sense that the government's paying it off. But then another government agency, the Social Security agency, is receiving the revenue, right? That's what I meant when I said it's like taking $1 of money and transferring it from one pocket of your jeans to another pocket of your jeans. So when we pay off debt that's internal, what we're really doing is redistributing income without impacting the average level of income in society. It's different when we owe debt to foreigners. So external debt is government debt that's owed to individuals in foreign countries. And I can tell you this has increased substantially in recent modern times. So if you look at the debt to GDP ratio after World War II, it was as high, if not higher, than it is today. No doubt about it. But it was all owed internally. Either it was one government agency borrowing from another, or from citizens through the sale of war bonds or treasuries, etc. And when that money was paid off, it redistributed income within the U.S. economy, but it didn't have any impact on the average level of income in the U.S. economy. When we owe a lot of what we have borrowed to foreign countries, it is at least possible that when we pay that debt off in the future, it is going to lead to a lower standard of living in our country, because that money that we're paying because of past borrowing is actually leaving our economy. Right? It's not being moved from one piece of our economy or one sector of our economy to another, or one individual to another within our economy. It's literally leaving our economy. And so I think if you talk to most economists about why they're potentially concerned about the large amount of debt that we've accumulated, they would really point to the split between internal and external debt and how that's changed over time. So I want to show you a picture of that also. Okay, so here's the ownership of U.S. government debt. Okay, this is a breakdown. Gee, I think this is for. I think I collected this. I think this comes from your textbook. Yeah, and I think that this one is for like 2016. Anyway, it doesn't. This is a stock figure. It's debt, so it doesn't change very rapidly. And this is going to be roughly reflective of what it is now in 2020 also. The percentages could change a little bit. But basically, what you're seeing is that the debt that the U.S. government owes, they owe 28% of it to U.S. individuals and firms. That is to say, the private sector. Okay? They owe 15% of it to the Federal Reserve. Remember, the Federal Reserve buys and sells treasuries and government securities in order to influence bank reserves and influence the Fed funds rate and interest rates. So that is government debt that's owed to another department of the government. Okay? Same thing for Social Security. Remember the Social Security Trust Fund, right? So all of that excess money that's flowing into Social Security through FICA payments and payroll taxes, right? We're collecting more than we need to pay beneficiaries, at least for now. That's going to switch around because of the demographics, but at least for now. All of that money is put in a Social Security Trust Fund, and all of that money in that trust fund is used to purchase U.S. government treasuries. Okay, so the government owes 15% of its debt to that Social Security Trust Fund, one government agency to another. And then other U.S. government trust funds, 10%. Okay, what's grown considerably over time is the amount of the debt that the government owes to foreign individuals. That is now at 32%. That's substantially higher than what it owes to U.S. individuals and households. So in the face of large government budget deficits and deficit spending to fund things like a war in Iraq or a war in Afghanistan and other budget priorities, U.S. households have not curtailed their consumption and increased their savings in order to finance that government debt. And so how do we finance it? Well, we finance it by borrowing from foreigners. And I would point out again what we've talked about several times, particularly you may have forgotten it because we talked about it more at the beginning of the semester, and it feels like 10 years has passed since then with everything that's gone on. But when we borrow money from foreigners, that's the flip side of running a trade deficit, right? So the way that we borrow from foreigners is essentially by running a trade deficit in goods and services. You have to remember that all the cash flows of the United States, that position between the United States and the rest of the world is determined by two accounts, right? The current account, which measures the trade balance for goods and services, versus what we call the balance on the financial account, which determines the amount of net savings that we're borrowing from the rest of the world. And that's essentially like a balance sheet. It has to balance. So when we're running a trade deficit, that implies that we're borrowing money from the rest of the world to finance the deficit. That's an inflow of loanable funds and capital from the rest of the world. And that inflow of capital from the rest of the world is what's financing a lot of the government borrowing. And that is directly dollar for dollar related to the trade deficit, which has created so much controversy and has been, really I think it's kind of a little bit of a paradox that Trump is so concerned about the trade deficit on one hand, but on the other hand, a $1 trillion budget deficit, if it's not associated with either a collapse in domestic investment or an increase in domestic savings, it's going to have to translate into, a dollar for dollar increase in the trade deficit. So kind of two policies that are kind of working against each other. One having a very large budget deficit, but on the other hand, being very skeptical of trade deficits. So I promised that this would be a pretty short discussion. I think we're getting reasonably close to the end. The federal debt held by the public, and this is from the Congressional Budget Office, they're very, very nonpartisan, and it's full of economists, that we're not particularly partisan in economics. We have our political biases, but, basic positive economic analysis, not normative economic analysis, but positive economic analysis is, driven mostly by economic theory and an application of data to that economic theory. And so what you can see is that over time, the amount of federal debt that's held by the public has increased, substantially. Right, so the government indebtedness overall as a percentage of GDP has increased. So there, sometimes you'll see these debt to GDP ratios. I guess I should mention that, you don't want to just look at the dollar value of debt. What you'd really like to do is measure debt relative to your assets, because your assets give you a measure of your ability to handle debt. So, if I have a 401k and a savings account, a money market mutual fund, and a checking account, and my balance overall, and my equity in my house and all that, if all that's worth $800,000, then I can afford to handle a lot more debt, right, than somebody who maybe has a savings account balance, a checking account balance, maybe they're a renter, so they don't have any equity in their house, etc. If their net worth is considerably lower, if their net worth, say, is $50,000, then they can't afford to handle as much debt as I'm able to, right? And so we can't just look at the dollar value of debt. We need to measure it relative to assets. But here's the thing. It would be very easy for me to measure my debt relative to assets. I have two main pieces of debt. What I have left on my mortgage, and I have one car that I'm still making some payments on. That's pretty much my debt, right? I could take that and I can divide that by the value of the other two vehicles that I own outright, the equity in my house. Those are my main assets. And my 401k, that's pretty substantial. And whatever I have my checking and savings account. And I could look at that ratio. And if that ratio is small, it means that, I'm doing pretty well in terms of my debt. I'm handling my debt well. Right? And if I calculate that type of a ratio and it's very high, it means that I've taken on a lot of debt that I might not be able to handle if my current personal financial situation takes a downturn. The same is true for overall economies. The problem with measuring debt to assets for the economy, though, is that it's pretty hard to measure the economic value of assets for the aggregate economy. I mean, really, anything that exists in the economy that the government is capable of legally taxing is essentially an asset for the government, right? So, it's really tough to get a good, accurate measure of the government's assets. And so instead, what we have done in economics is divided the debt, which is a stock figure, not by assets, which is also the appropriate stock figure to look at. We've divided it by GDP instead, which is a flow figure. So it's a little bit wonky to do that. It's not a perfect measure of an economy's ability to handle its debt, but it's better than nothing. And it's probably more accurate to track that over time than to try to come up with some measure of the federal government's assets, which is, just nearly impossible. So what we see here then, coming back to the graph, is that the debt to GDP ratio essentially tells us how many years would it take us to pay off the debt, right? How many years would it take us to pay off the debt at the current level of GDP. And when it reaches 100%, it means it would take us 1 full year's worth of GDP in order to pay off the debt. And you can see that we're close to 100% in terms of the debt to GDP ratio. And I should mention that this measure here only includes debt held by the public, not debt that one government agency owes to another. So there's a bit of a discussion there about whether when you look at the debt to GDP ratio, should you be looking at only debt that non-government agencies hold relative to GDP, or should you also include the debt that one government agency owes to another government agency? And so the debt to GDP ratio looks lower if you only include debt held by the public, which is why you see this figure, it's not well below 100%, but it's below 100%. And sometimes you'll see people say the debt to GDP ratio has gone over 100%. And that's true, but that's a different measure of the debt to GDP ratio. It includes the debt, right? All of this debt that government agencies owe to other government agencies. So that would be the discrepancy if you ever see two different debt to GDP ratios that differ by 20% or so. And actually, here would be more than 20%. I mean, here would be 20, looks like 30, 40%, right? Could be a substantial, really. Well, these are just percentages of overall debt, not relative to GDP. But you could certainly see a pretty. If you see one debt to GDP ratio for a year, and it looks a lot lower than the debt to GDP ratio that somebody else is reporting, that's the reason why. Some people prefer to measure debt held by the public, both the U.S. public and foreigners, relative to GDP, and some economists prefer to include the debt that government agencies owe to each other. Okay. Here's the big thing, right? This is the thing that economists worry about the most in terms of debt. The debt held by foreign investors has increased substantially as a percentage of our overall debt over time. This goes back to 2000, okay? We've got 9/11, we've got a brief recession back in 2001. You can see that the debt, the percentage, this is actually the dollar value, it's not even a percentage. The dollar value of the debt held by domestic investors has increased only slightly over time. But you can see that as we opened up wars in Iraq and Iran and et cetera, that the debt that we owe to foreigners has increased substantially here. Right? So our overall debt is increasing, our debt to GDP ratio is increasing, and we owe an awful lot more to foreign investors than we owe to domestic investors, and that is new. Okay? That is not the situation that the U.S. economy was in post-World War II when we had a high debt to GDP ratio, but we owed most of it to ourselves, whether that was one government agency owing the debt to another government agency, or it was the government owing money to a U.S. citizen, a household, or a business. So this increased indebtedness to foreigners implies that as we pay off the debt, that wealth will be leaving the U.S. economy, and the question is has that been worth it or not? And that's an open debate. That's at the center of the debate between economists who believe that the debt to GDP ratio is something that we should worry about, and the other economists who would argue that the debt to GDP ratio is something we shouldn't overly concern ourselves with. And there are definitely both of those camps, and economists are definitely debating that issue. Was there something else I wanted to say about that before we move on to the end here? No, I'll save that for the end. Let's talk about one more thing, and then I'll just give you something to think about. So, U.S. debt compared to other foreign debt. You can see that the U.S. economy has a debt to GDP ratio here that's about 100%. So I know that with that 100% figure, whoever calculated this debt to GDP ratio is using both public debt and debt that the government owes to itself. And when you take that ratio, it's about 100%. Okay? If you compare that to other OECD countries, right? So economically developed countries, you see that there are plenty of economies that have lower debt to GDP ratios like Germany or Sweden, where they seem to really have their financial house in order. In Australia at only 29%. And then you can see that there are definitely other countries that have much higher debt to GDP ratios, but those that have debt to GDP ratios that are higher than the United States are economies that have really have had a lot more macroeconomic trouble over the last 20 or 30 years than the United States has had. Right, and that includes Italy for sure, but definitely Greece, where I'm sure we can all remember 2013 and all the problems that Greece had in terms of the solvency and managing its debt. In Japan, they've been in an economic stagnation for at least since the 1980s, and a lot of economists who are structural stagnationists would argue that the Japanese actually they were mistaken in thinking that their economic slowdown was something that they could overcome by a fiscal stimulus. They've run large government budget deficits to try to stimulate their economy. But when you're actually experiencing a slowdown in the growth rate of potential GDP, rather than some type of an aggregate demand shock, you're not going to get everything that you would expect out of a fiscal policy. And all you're going to end up doing is increasing your debt to GDP ratio. You're not going to do anything with this stimulus spending that is going to cause potential GDP to shift to the right more quickly over time or to recover potential GDP growth. And in fact, that has been the experience of the Japanese economy. So if the slowdown in the Japanese economy that they experienced in the 80s and the 90s, like those lost decades, they call them the lost decades in Japan, if those had been the result of aggregate demand shocks, then the stimulus spending probably would have returned Japan to potential GDP. Truth is that Japan has been at potential GDP probably, but potential GDP has just been growing more slowly. And if that's the case, increasing fiscal stimulus or having a big budget deficit and borrowing to spend money isn't going to really lead to higher potential GDP growth necessarily. Instead, it could just, really inflate your debt to GDP ratio. And that's what we see here occurring in Japan. So if you look at the, most of the economies that have debt to GDP ratios that are higher than the U.S., these are definitely economies that have struggled with macroeconomic problems, which leads, some economists to be pretty concerned with the debt to GDP ratio in the United States of 100%. But then, other economists will argue that, well, yeah, these economies have high debt to GDP ratios, but their problems aren't caused by a high debt to GDP ratios. Their high debt to GDP ratios are caused by their economic problems. Do you know what I mean? And the structure of the U.S. economy suggests we're not going to suffer from those same structural problems. So it is an open debate and something for you to think about for sure. It's a very important consideration. Okay, so I'll leave this up here and I'll just kind of give you, kind of an analogy to think about when you think about whether or not the U.S. government should have a large debt to GDP ratio, whether or not deficit spending is a good idea. And when I talk about this, I'm thinking more about the structural deficit than the cyclical deficit. So to be clear, I'm very in favor of the $2 billion stimulus package that Congress passed and that the president signed into law. I think it's a good. I don't think it's a great stimulus package because I'm not sure it's going to fully address all of the economic issues that we face, but it's certainly better than nothing. We may not have the perfect set of macroeconomic tools to deal with the current situation. That doesn't mean, though, that you don't try to do everything that you can. So I'm in favor of that stimulus package. Something I'll talk more about with you at the end of the course, as I promised. So I'm thinking more about, just whether or not you're running a structural deficit and you're accumulating a lot of debt through a structural deficit over time. Is that a good idea or not? Well, you can build an analogy to your own personal situation, right? So you guys are all in college. And I would presume that you're in college because you believe that after you get out of college, you will have a higher standard of living than you would have had if you had gone out into the workforce with a high school diploma, right? And there are all kinds of different ways that a college degree will enhance your quality of life, later on. Not just because you'll make more money, but there are all kinds of other great things that you learn about in college and passions that you can discover. But here, because I'm dealing with numbers, I'm thinking a little bit more about your potential income stream, and that is not the only benefit from going to college. So make that clear. If you come to college and you can't afford to pay it all at once, you're going to borrow money and become indebted over time. But if you study hard in college and you pick a major that you have a passion in, and you're going to be able to get out of college eventually and have a much higher income stream and standard of living than you would have had if you had not gone to college. That would imply that you'll be able to make money when you get out of college that will allow you to pay back everything that you borrowed and still have a better standard of living, not just because you have more money, but you get to enjoy all of the other intangible benefits from having a college education also. And in that case, becoming indebted now to pay for college, even though it's not easy, and paying it back might not be easy, in the end it's well worth it. Because if you weren't able to borrow that money and become indebted for a while, then you would never get to enjoy all those benefits of your education. So that's one way of looking at the economy borrowing money, or the U.S. government running up debt. If we're borrowing that money, but we're taking that money that we're borrowing and we're investing it in good projects that have high returns, then we will be in a better financial situation in the future than we would have otherwise been in. And that better financial situation will allow us to pay back everything that we borrow with interest and still have a higher standard of living than we would have had without the borrowing. That's the optimistic scenario. So people who don't worry about the debt to GDP ratio take that view of U.S. federal government borrowing. Okay? Other people believe that that is an overly optimistic point of view. So to go back to your situation, if you come to college and you borrow all that money and you don't study hard and you don't learn anything and you get very low grades in all of your classes, and then you leave college and you get a job that's basically the same type of employment that you would have gotten if you had just left high school and went straight into the labor force, then there are going to be very few benefits for you from having attended college. And not only that, but you've racked up a whole lot of debt over that period of time. If you're borrowing money, it's going to be a real burden to pay it back, right? And in that case, what you're doing is you're really using the money that you're borrowing to finance a certain lifestyle and level of consumption today that you really can't afford in the future. And if that's the case, you'll be worse off in the future for having borrowed the money, right? And so people who are pessimistic about U.S. federal government borrowing take that a point of view. Like the United States is like this irresponsible college student who borrows all this money, and they go to they go to college and they don't study hard and they don't really learn anything, and they don't actually improve their prospects for the future. And then when it comes time to pay back everything that they borrowed, they're actually worse off than they would have been had they not borrowed the money in the first place. So there is an analogy, a personal analogy here that you can kind of hang your hat on to think about whether or not borrowing on the part of the federal government is a good idea or a bad idea. And unfortunately, just like with college students, there's no way to make a definitive to provide a definitive answer as to whether or not that borrowing is a good idea or a bad idea. It depends on the individual circumstances of the individual. In the case of the college students and their motivations and what they're doing with their resources, and the same thing is true for countries. It may very well be the case that borrowing to the level of a debt to GDP ratio for Japan at 226% is a really bad idea, but in the United States, all of that money that we would be borrowing would be used more productively, and it wouldn't be a problem for the United States. I mean, it's possible, and so those are really hard questions to answer. All right, so stuff to think about there. We're moving towards the end. We just have one more chapter that I would like to cover with you. Okay, so look out for those videos to be popping up on Moodle soon.